Picture this. March 26, 1883. The Vanderbilt Mansion on Fifth Avenue, New York City. Alva Vanderbilt is throwing a costume ball, 1,200 guests. Each costume costs an average of $1,000. The decorations alone, 60,000 roses, cost $15,000. Total cost of one evening's entertainment, $250,000. In today's money, that's $7.5 million for a party. Now picture this. Outside those same walls, the men who built that mansion earned $1.50 per day for 12-hour shifts, 6 days a week. $9 a week, $450 a year. Which means Alva Vanderbilt's party cost more than 500 families could earn in an entire year of backbreaking labor. Here's the question: how long can a system like that last? The answer: exactly 40 years. The Gilded Age. We know the names: Carnegie, Rockefeller, Morgan, Vanderbilt. We know the mansions: Biltmore's 250 rooms, the Breakers overlooking the Atlantic, Frick's Palace on Fifth Avenue. We know the numbers: fortunes measured not in millions but in billions by today's standards. Andrew Carnegie's income in 1900, $23 million in a single year, equivalent to what 57,000 steel workers would earn in their entire lifetimes. But here's what those marble halls don't tell you. This system, this concentration of wealth, this arrangement where 1% of families controlled 45% of everything, wasn't just immoral. It was mathematically impossible to sustain. Not because workers revolted, most strikes were crushed. Not because the rich had a change of heart, they didn't. Not because the economy collapsed, industrial output was exploding. The Gilded Age ended because it contained 4 structural contradictions that made continuation impossible. And what's remarkable is that almost no one saw it coming. They built mansions designed to last 500 years. They accumulated art collections for dynasties that would never materialize. They acted as if this arrangement was permanent. This is the story of why it wasn't, why it couldn't be, and why understanding those contradictions might matter more than you think. The term Gilded Age comes from Mark Twain, 1873. He meant it as mockery, gold leaf covering base metal, a surface that looked valuable, hiding something cheap underneath. But the Titans didn't see it that way. They believed they'd discovered something fundamentally new: industrial capitalism, mass production, scientific management, a system that could generate wealth without limit. And the evidence seemed overwhelming. Between 1870 and 1900, American steel production increased 700%. Railroad mileage tripled. The United States went from being a debtor nation to the richest country on earth. Individual fortunes grew at rates that defied historical precedent. John D. Rockefeller's net worth in 1913, $900 million, more than 1.5% of the entire American economy. To put that in perspective, Jeff Bezos at his peak owned roughly 0.8% of the US economy. Rockefeller owned twice that proportion. Carnegie, when he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901, walked away with $480 million. That's $15 billion in today's money, from a single transaction. These weren't just rich men. They were wealth on a scale the world had never seen. and they built accordingly. George Vanderbilt began construction on Biltmore in 1889. 6 years of work, 11 million bricks, 1,000 workers. The largest private residence in America, 250 rooms, 4 acres under one roof. It was designed to last 500 years, like a European castle, a monument to permanence. Andrew Carnegie bought Skibo Castle in Scotland and filled it with servants, peacocks, and an organ that played itself. He wrote essays about how the wealthy had a duty to be custodians of civilization. Henry Clay Frick built his mansion on Fifth Avenue specifically to become a museum. He knew from the beginning it would outlive him. That was the point. These men weren't planning for their lifetimes. They were planning for dynasties. Because they believed the system that made them rich would last forever. But here's what they missed. By 1890, 1% of American families owned 45% of the nation's wealth. Not just income, wealth. The accumulated property, assets, capital. The top 10% owned 72%. Which means 90% of Americans shared 28% of everything. And the wealth wasn't just concentrated, it was accelerating. Between 1870 and 1913, the share of wealth held by the top 1% doubled. Not because the economy was shrinking, it was exploding, but the gains were flowing almost entirely upward. Now, here's the question the Titans never asked. What happens to an economy when wealth concentrates that completely? They assumed it didn't matter. They thought wealth creation was independent of distribution. You build steel mills, they produce steel, you get richer. Simple. What they didn't understand was that an industrial economy has structural requirements. It needs customers who can buy the products. It needs workers who aren't one paycheck from starvation. It needs some mechanism to convert production into consumption. The Gilded Age system had none of that. Average industrial workers in 1890 earned $9 a week, 52 weeks a year if they were lucky. Most industries shut down seasonally. Call it $450 annually. Out of that, rent took $2 to $3 a week. Food for a family, $4 to $5. Coal for heat, clothing, everything else, whatever was left. Which was almost nothing. 80% of income went to survival. The remaining 20%, $90 a year, had to cover everything from shoes to furniture to any form of recreation. There was no consumer economy because there were no consumers. And yet the Titans kept building factories to produce more goods, more steel, more textiles, more machinery. For whom? Andrew Carnegie wrote an essay in 1889 called The Gospel of Wealth. His thesis, the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few was not just acceptable, but necessary, because only men of superior ability could be trusted to deploy capital efficiently. The rich, Carnegie argued, were trustees of civilization. They would use their fortunes to build libraries, universities, concert halls, things that benefited everyone, even if the masses couldn't afford to be rich themselves. It was a beautiful theory. And it required one crucial assumption, that the system generating such wealth could continue indefinitely. That assumption was wrong. Not because Carnegie was immoral, though his steel mills killed workers at rates that would horrify modern Americans. Not because the system was inefficient, industrial output was soaring, but because it contained internal contradictions that made continuation impossible. 4 specific contradictions. And between 1890 and 1920, they converged to destroy the world Carnegie thought he'd built. Let's examine them one by one. Every Gilded Age fortune rested on the same foundation: cheap labor. Not just affordable, cheap. Suppressed to the absolute minimum required to keep workers alive and working. Andrew Carnegie paid his steel workers $1.50 per day for 12-hour shifts. That's $9 a week, assuming they worked 6 days without injury or layoff. Textile mills in New England paid women 75 cents for the same hours. Children, and there were 1.75 million children working in American factories in 1890, earned 30 to 50 cents. The logic was simple. Lower labor costs meant higher profits. And since there was always another immigrant desperate for work, there was no reason to pay more than survival wages. This worked brilliantly for individual businesses. But collectively, it created a trap. Because here's what Carnegie and his peers never quite grasped. Every businessman wants to pay his workers as little as possible. But every businessman needs other people's workers to earn enough to buy his products. It's a classic collective action problem. If you run a steel mill, you want your workers to earn barely enough to survive. But you need coal miners to earn enough to buy steel products. If you run a coal mine, you want your miners to earn barely enough. But you need factory workers to afford coal for heating. Everyone's optimal strategy individually is everyone's disaster collectively. January 5th, 1914. Henry Ford makes an announcement that shocks industrial America. He's doubling his workers' pay, from $2.50 per day to $5. His fellow industrialists think he's lost his mind. You don't pay workers more than you have to. That's the whole point. But Ford understood something they didn't. He'd just invented the assembly line, mass production. His factories could now build cars faster and cheaper than anyone in history. But who was going to buy them? Not his workers. They couldn't afford cars on standard industrial wages. Not other people's workers. Same problem. Ford realized that mass production was worthless without mass consumption. And mass consumption required wages high enough to actually consume. The $5 day wasn't charity, it was self-interest. Within 2 years, Ford's workers were buying Model Ts. His competitors' workers couldn't afford them, and Ford dominated the market. He'd broken the collective action trap by being the first to see that suppressed wages suppressed his own market. But here's the tragedy. He was 40 years too late. By 1914, the Gilded Age system was already crumbling. The wage suppression that built the fortunes was killing the economy those fortunes depended on. Let's do the math that the Titans never did. In 1890, America had a population of 63 million. The labor force was about 23 million. Average annual income for a worker, $450. Total labor income, roughly $10 billion. Now remember, 80% went to survival, food, rent, fuel. Only 20%, $2 billion, was available for discretionary spending. Total national income that same year, $13 billion. $3 billion, almost 25% of the entire economy, went to the top 1%, to people who already had everything they needed. Do you see the problem? The economy was producing goods that required mass consumption, but the distribution of income made mass consumption mathematically impossible. Carnegie's steel mills could produce rails faster than ever, but who was building new railroads when there weren't enough customers to justify existing lines? Textile mills could weave cloth at incredible scale, but who was buying new clothes when workers wore the same outfit until it literally fell apart? Every industry was racing to increase production, but the market, the actual people with money to spend, was barely growing. Some of that excess production went to luxury goods for the rich, the mansions, the yachts, the art collections. But you can only build so many mansions, and a 100-room house doesn't employ as many people as 100 one-room apartments. The system was built on a paradox: suppress wages to maximize profit, but depend on wages to create customers. And by 1900, the paradox was becoming visible. Industrial growth was slowing, not because factories were less efficient, but because there weren't enough buyers. Wage suppression had worked, until it didn't. But that was just the first contradiction. J.P. Morgan hated chaos. Competition was wasteful, he believed, inefficient. Dozens of railroad companies fighting over the same routes, cutting prices, driving each other into bankruptcy. Why not consolidate? By 1900, Morgan controlled 40% of America's railroad mileage, not through a single company, through a web of interlocking directorates, boards he sat on, banks he controlled, bonds he underwrote. This was called Morganization, turn chaotic competition into orderly oligopoly. And it was spectacularly profitable. In 1901, Morgan orchestrated the creation of U.S. Steel, the first billion-dollar corporation in American history. It controlled 70% of domestic steel production. No more price wars, no more excess capacity, no more uncertainty. Just reliable, massive profits. Rockefeller had done the same with oil. By 1890, Standard Oil controlled 88% of refined oil in America. He could set prices. He could dictate terms to railroads. He could destroy any competitor who challenged him. This was capitalism's endgame, the Titans believed. Consolidation created efficiency. Efficiency created wealth. Everyone won. Except they didn't. Here's what monopoly actually does. It eliminates the pressure to improve. Standard Oil controlled the market so completely that Rockefeller stopped investing in new technology. Why innovate when you have no competitors? Between 1890 and 1911, the basic refining process at Standard Oil barely changed. They weren't developing new products. They weren't finding more efficient methods. They were just extracting maximum profit from their position. Meanwhile, in Europe and other parts of the world, companies without monopoly positions were innovating, developing new chemicals from petroleum byproducts, creating new markets. By 1911, when the Supreme Court broke up Standard Oil, the company was technologically stagnant. Its dominance was administrative, not productive. U.S. Steel had the same problem. After the 1901 merger, investment in new technology dropped. Labor productivity at Carnegie Steel had been increasing 5% annually in the 1890s. After Morgan took over, productivity growth nearly stopped. Why? Because U.S. Steel didn't need to be efficient. It just needed to control the market. Monopoly looked like the pinnacle of capitalist success, but it was actually capitalism eating itself. Now here's where it gets interesting. The Titans justified their fortunes through a very specific ideology: social Darwinism. The idea that competition selects for the most capable, and the wealthy prove their superiority by winning that competition. Carnegie loved this argument. The law of competition, he wrote, may be sometimes hard for the individual, but it is best for the race, because it ensures the survival of the fittest. Rockefeller made the same case. His domination of the oil industry wasn't unfair. It was proof that he was the most capable competitor. But what happens when competition ends? When Rockefeller controlled 88% of the market, there was no competition. When US Steel set prices, there was no competition. The ideology collapsed. If your wealth isn't earned through competition, what justifies it? Teddy Roosevelt understood this. He wasn't a socialist. He was trying to save capitalism from capitalists. In 1902, he filed an antitrust suit against J.P. Morgan's Northern Securities Railroad Trust. Morgan was shocked. He'd assumed Roosevelt would see consolidation as progress. Roosevelt saw it as self-destruction. Of all forms of tyranny, he'd later write, the least attractive and the most vulgar is the tyranny of mere wealth. Not because wealth was wrong, but because when wealth became so concentrated that competition disappeared, the entire ideological foundation of capitalism crumbled. Between 1890 and 1914, the federal government filed dozens of antitrust suits, not because politicians had become radical, but because monopoly power had become incompatible with the stated justification for capitalism itself. Standard Oil was broken up in 1911. US Steel survived only by agreeing to government oversight. The Titans thought consolidation was the ultimate achievement. It was actually the beginning of the end, because monopoly killed the very competition that justified the system. That was the second contradiction. By 1900, something had changed in how wealth was generated. In the 1870s and 1880s, fortunes came from production. You built a steel mill. You refined oil. You manufactured products. But by 1900, the real money was in finance. Not lending to productive businesses, speculation. Railroad speculation was particularly insane. Between 1865 and 1900, American railroad companies built 170,000 miles of track. 1 in 6 miles was redundant, built not because there was demand, but because investors would buy stock in anything called a railroad. Towns competed to attract rail lines by offering free land and subsidies. So companies built lines to nowhere, collected the subsidies, sold the stock, and let the lines go bankrupt. It didn't matter if the railroads ever made money. What mattered was the stock price during the initial offering. This was wealth creation through financial engineering, and it was incredibly lucrative for those who understood the game. But it created systemic fragility. October 1907, a Tuesday. The Knickerbocker Trust Company collapses. It was the third largest trust in New York, and it had been making massive speculative bets on copper mining stocks and railroad bonds. When those bets failed, Knickerbocker couldn't cover its obligations. Depositors rushed to withdraw their money. The bank didn't have it. And because trusts weren't required to hold reserves the way banks were, Knickerbocker had nothing to fall back on. It failed. Within hours, panic spread to other trusts, then to banks, then to stock brokerages. The entire American financial system was collapsing. There was no Federal Reserve, no lender of last resort, no coordinated response. Just J.P. Morgan. On the night of October 24th, Morgan summoned every major banker in New York to his library. He locked the doors, and he told them they weren't leaving until they agreed to pool their resources to stop the panic. They negotiated through the night. Morgan sat in another room playing solitaire, his way of thinking. At 4:45 a.m., he presented them with an agreement. Each bank would contribute to a rescue fund. Morgan would coordinate which institutions were saved and which were allowed to fail. They signed. The panic stopped. But think about what just happened. The American economy survived because one man, one private citizen, had enough personal authority to force a solution. That wasn't a system, that was emergency improvisation. And everyone knew it. Here's why speculation had become unavoidable. By 1900, the Titans had accumulated so much wealth that productive investment couldn't absorb it. Carnegie's income was $23 million per year. How do you invest that productively? You can build new steel mills, but if there aren't enough customers, those mills lose money. You can expand railroads, but 1 in 6 miles was already redundant. So where does the money go? Speculation, financial engineering, buying stock in ventures that may never earn a profit, but will definitely see rising stock prices as long as more money keeps flowing in. It's a treadmill. You need 15 to 20% returns to maintain your lifestyle and your sense of wealth. But productive investment might yield 3 to 5%. So you speculate. And when speculation becomes the primary source of returns, the entire economy becomes a house of cards. One failure, one bad bet, cascades into system-wide collapse. The panic of 1907 proved that the Gilded Age economy was too fragile to survive. Morgan's rescue worked, but Morgan was 70 years old. What happened when he died? The answer came in 1913. Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act. Not because politicians wanted government control, but because everyone agreed that an economy requiring personal intervention by J.P. Morgan couldn't last. The third contradiction. Speculation became necessary to maintain wealth, but speculation made the system unsustainable. And there was one more contradiction, the most visible of all. European aristocrats understood something American titans didn't. Hide your wealth. The great estates of England and France were built in the countryside, behind forests, at the end of long private roads. You couldn't see them unless you were invited. That invisibility was strategic. If peasants couldn't see the wealth, they couldn't resent it. American titans made the opposite choice. They built on Fifth Avenue, in full view of everyone. The Vanderbilt mansions lined Fifth Avenue between 50th and 58th Streets, each one larger and more ostentatious than the last. The Astors held court at 34th Street, the Carnegies at 91st, Frick eventually at 70th. And every day, workers walked past these palaces on their way to jobs that paid $9 a week. The contrast wasn't abstract, it was visible, impossible to ignore. William Henry Vanderbilt, worth $200 million in 1885, gave an interview where a reporter asked about public relations. His response? "The public be damned." That quote appeared in newspapers across the country, and it crystallized something millions of people were already feeling. The rich didn't just have wealth, they had contempt. In 1890, Jacob Riis published How the Other Half Lives. It was a book of photographs, tenement apartments in New York, families living in single rooms, children sleeping on floors, hallways without light or ventilation. The photographs were shocking, not because poverty was new, but because middle-class Americans had never seen it this clearly. Photography made inequality visible in ways that words never could. Newspapers began running illustrations of Vanderbilt balls next to images of child laborers. The contrast was devastating. Upton Sinclair published The Jungle in 1906, a novel about meatpacking plants. The conditions were so horrific, workers falling into rendering vats, rat droppings mixed into sausage, that readers were physically ill. President Theodore Roosevelt read it. He ordered an investigation. The Pure Food and Drug Act passed later that year. One novel changed federal law, because visibility creates pressure. Ida Tarbell spent years researching Standard Oil. In 1904, she published her exposé as a series in McClure's magazine. She didn't editorialize, she just documented how Rockefeller forced competitors out, how he manipulated railroad rates, how he crushed anyone who challenged him. Middle-class readers were outraged, not at the existence of monopoly, they'd always known that, but at the specific mechanisms, the dirty details. Visibility creates demands for action. By 1910, the political equation had changed. It wasn't just radicals demanding reform. It was the middle class. Women's suffrage movements converged with labor organizing, not because they agreed on everything, but because both saw that the system was rigged. In 1912, 4 candidates ran for president: Teddy Roosevelt, Progressive; William Howard Taft, Republican; Woodrow Wilson, Democrat; and Eugene Debs, Socialist. Debs won 6% of the vote. 913,000 Americans voted for an openly socialist candidate. That terrified the establishment, not because Debs would win, but because those votes represented a permanent constituency demanding fundamental change. Wilson won, and he immediately pushed for reforms the Titans had opposed for decades. Income tax, ratified as the 16th Amendment in 1913, the first permanent federal income tax. Top rate, 7% on income over $500,000. It sounds low, but the principle was revolutionary. The federal government claimed the right to directly tax wealth. The Federal Reserve Act, also 1913, taking control of money supply away from private bankers. Direct election of senators, 17th Amendment, 1913. Previously, senators were chosen by state legislatures, which could be bought. Now they faced voters directly. 3 constitutional amendments in 1 year. The most dramatic transformation of federal power in American history outside of war. Why? Because the visibility of inequality had made the old system politically indefensible. The Titans could have hidden, built estates in Montana or upstate New York, kept their wealth private. Instead, they built monuments. They threw parties that cost more than workers earned in a year. They made inequality impossible to ignore. And once people saw it, they demanded change. That was the 4th contradiction. Visibility destroyed the system that created the wealth. Between 1910 and 1920, something unprecedented happened. All 4 contradictions converged. Wage suppression had created an economy with too little demand. The Titans responded by cutting wages further to maintain profits, which made the problem worse. Monopoly concentration had eliminated innovation. Productivity growth stalled. Returns fell. The Titans responded by merging more companies, which killed more competition. Financial speculation had replaced productive investment. When World War I disrupted trade, speculative bets failed. the Titans doubled down on domestic speculation, which made the system more fragile. And all of it was visible, photographed, documented, reported in newspapers read by millions. The system couldn't adapt because every response to one contradiction worsened the others. You can't pay workers less forever. Eventually, there's no one to buy your products. You can't eliminate all competition forever. Eventually, there's no justification for your wealth. You can't speculate forever. Eventually, the bets fail. And you can't build palaces in full view forever. Eventually, people demand you tear them down. By 1920, the old order was dead. Not destroyed, but transformed beyond recognition. In 1870, the top 1% of American families controlled 25% of national wealth. By 1913, the peak of the Gilded Age, they controlled 45%. That's the highest concentration of wealth in American history, before or since. By 1929, it had dropped to 40%. Still enormous, but with institutional checks in place: income tax, Federal Reserve, antitrust enforcement, labor protections. By 1945, after the New Deal and World War II, it was down to 25%, back to where it started. That's not decline, that's correction. The Gilded Age didn't end because the Titans became poor. It ended because the system that created their wealth became ungovernable. The four contradictions didn't destroy capitalism, they transformed it. Wage suppression gave way to minimum wage laws and collective bargaining. Monopoly power gave way to antitrust enforcement and regulatory oversight. Financial speculation gave way to the Federal Reserve and securities regulation. Elite visibility gave way to progressive taxation and public accountability. It wasn't revolution, it was adaptation under pressure. Today you can visit Biltmore. It's still owned by the Vanderbilt family. 250 rooms, 4 acres under one roof. Still magnificent. You can visit the Frick Collection, one of the most beautiful art museums in America. You can see the Morgan Library, the Astor Estates, the remnants of the world the Titans built. And they are genuinely remarkable. The craftsmanship, the scale, the beauty. But here's what they don't tell you. They were built with a system that couldn't last. Not because it was immoral, though it was, but because it was mathematically impossible. You can't suppress wages and expect mass consumption. You can't eliminate competition and expect innovation. You can't replace production with speculation and expect stability. And you can't build monuments to inequality and expect political acceptance. The mansions survived. The system that built them didn't. George Vanderbilt designed Biltmore to last 500 years. The estate is only 130 years old. It's not even a third of the way there. But the Gilded Age itself lasted 40 years, from roughly 1870 to 1910. 40 years. One party that cost more than 500 families could earn in a year. That's how long the contradictions took to converge. The illusion of infinite wealth wasn't destroyed by moral awakening. It was destroyed by mathematics. So here's the question this story asks. Does any of this sound familiar? Today, the top 1% of American families control roughly 32% of national wealth. Not as high as 1913, but climbing. Wage growth has been stagnant for decades. Productivity keeps increasing. The gap between them keeps widening. Corporate consolidation has reached levels not seen since the Gilded Age. 4 companies control 70% of beef processing. 3 companies control 90% of pesticides. 2 companies control half of all book sales. Financial speculation has replaced long-term investment. Stock buybacks, private equity, cryptocurrencies that produce nothing but promise infinite returns. And all of it, every merger, every mansion, every billionaire space launch, happens in full view, photographed, tweeted, impossible to ignore. The parallels aren't perfect. The modern economy has mechanisms the Gilded Age lacked: social security, unemployment insurance, antitrust enforcement, when it's actually used. But the contradictions are forming again. How long can you suppress wages and expect consumption? How long can you eliminate competition and expect innovation? How long can you prioritize speculation over production? How long can you make inequality this visible and expect political stability? The Gilded Age had an answer: 40 years. Maybe we're different this time. Maybe we've learned. Maybe the institutional guardrails will hold. Or maybe we're watching the same pattern play out at a different speed. Drop a comment. Are we living through the second Gilded Age? Or are the contradictions different this time? The mansions are still standing. The question is whether the system that built them will be. Thank you for watching.